Welcome to our channel. Before we get started, please consider liking and subscribing so we can bring more stories like this to you. I've lived most of my life in the UK, retiring as an accountant after 40-odd years of number crunching. My wife, Jill, and I always dreamed of spending our twilight years in a warmer climate, and our daughter's family was settled in the States. So, after countless Zoom calls and half a year of wrangling with visas and real estate agents, we finally flew across the pond to Florida. The plan was simple: retire in a cozy community where we could rest our feet, tend a small garden, and spend quality time with our grandkids. It sounded like a dream, until Karen from the HOA showed up at our door. Let me set the stage. This community was marketed as a 55-plus paradise, complete with a pool, a fitness center, and neatly trimmed lawns that looked pulled straight from a brochure. We moved into a modest single-story home with 2 bedrooms, a sunroom for Jill's plants, and a small backyard that overlooked a man-made pond. On day 1, we met a few neighbors who were pleasant enough: a retired Navy vet named Carl who played the harmonica in the afternoons, and a no-nonsense nurse called Ruth who walked her Doberman every morning. They welcomed us with warm smiles and typical Florida humor. "Don't worry about the gators, they don't bite unless you're slow." But alongside these friendly souls, there was Karen. 5'4", always wearing large designer sunglasses, she was chairperson of the Homeowners Association board. I'd heard horror stories about American HOAs, but nothing prepared me for the real thing. She wasted no time introducing herself on the second morning, barging onto our front porch just as I was about to sip my first cup of coffee. "Hello, I'm Karen. The A chair," she announced, thrusting a 3-ring binder into my hands. "Here is the community handbook. I assume you've read it thoroughly?" I'd skimmed it, sure. I knew the basics about lawn care, noise restrictions, and exterior paint colors. "Yes, I've reviewed most of it," I said, glancing at Jill who was perched on the porch swing, brow furrowing in concern. Karen pointed to our driveway. "Your daughter's SUV was parked overnight. As you should be aware, driveway parking is restricted after 11 p.m. Only vehicles with a resident sticker can remain." I raised an eyebrow. Our daughter, Sarah, had come for a late dinner and ended up staying the night. I had no idea this was a rule, especially since there seemed to be more empty driveways than cars in this community. I didn't realize that was an issue. Nobody mentioned it when we moved in. Karen folded her arms, tapping a manicured nail against her elbow. "Everything is spelled out in the handbook. It's the homeowner's responsibility to be well-versed on all regulations. Next time, you'll receive a formal warning." I managed a polite smile. It was our second day, and we were already on her radar. Part of me wanted to argue, but Jill squeezed my hand discreetly, her signal to keep calm. So I nodded, apologized, and watched Karen strut away, binder clutched like a weapon. I truly hoped that was the end of it, but Karen re-emerged 2 days later with a new complaint: our trash bin placement. According to her, it should have been precisely 3 feet away from the curb, not 2. I measured. "You're off by a foot," she declared, frowning at the black bin sitting on our driveway. I thought she was joking. But Karen did not joke. She threatened to issue a violation notice, whatever that entailed, if we didn't correct it immediately. So there I was at 6 in the morning, in my pajamas and slippers, dragging the bin a single foot back. Jill stood behind me in the doorway, hands on her hips, speechless. This was just the beginning of a stream of micromanagement that honestly left me baffled. We weren't causing trouble. In fact, we were the quietest new arrivals you could ask for. But it seemed Karen had made it her mission to ensure we were abiding by each paragraph, subsection, and bullet point of the HOA rules. One early evening, Jill was watering her succulents in the sunroom, and I was reading a newspaper when our grandkids, Dylan and Emily, came over. They are both in their teens. Dylan brought a skateboard, thinking he'd use the neighborhood's smooth sidewalks to practice a few tricks. Within 20 minutes, Karen appeared out of nowhere, scolding him for reckless endangerment. Dylan was just gliding around in slow circles, not even jumping curbs. She insisted that skateboards were unwelcome in common areas, though I'd seen older residents riding bicycles and electric scooters all the time. That night, Jill and I pored over the HOA handbook. Sure, we were aware there would be guidelines, but the language was so dense, It felt like an encyclopedia of restrictions. I felt a headache brewing just seeing how many ways we could get in trouble. We started to wonder, was it us? Were we just unlucky to move in next to the strictest HOA chairperson in Florida? I told myself, maybe Karen's just having a bad week. We didn't want any drama. We were new and eager to live peacefully. Yet, in the pit of my stomach, there was a nagging feeling we'd stepped into a different world, one where Karen reigned supreme, and the rest of us tiptoed around her every whim. But the real trouble hadn't even begun. That was just Karen easing us in. About a month into our new life in this retirement paradise, Jill came up with the idea to host a small charity yard sale. She's been passionate about crocheting blankets for local shelters, and she'd also accumulated years' worth of scarves, homemade crafts, and second-hand knickknacks from her friends back in the UK. Our garage was practically bursting with boxes, and we decided a yard sale could help raise money for the local animal rescue. We checked the HOA handbook again, carefully reading for any rules on private yard sales. Turns out they were allowed once a quarter, provided you obtained a permit from the board. A bit more formal than what we were used to, but fair enough. We filled out the forms, paid the nominal fee, and marked the date on the community calendar. Easy, right? Well, we received no feedback from the board for 2 weeks, so we assumed it was approved. Karen must have known about it, she was on every committee and subcommittee out there. But the day before the sale, we got an email from the HOA's official address stating our application was incomplete. No reason given. Just a subject line that read "Yard Sale Permit Denied" in large red letters. Alarmed, Jill rushed over to Karen's house, which was a few doors down. To our surprise, Karen's husband, Bob, answered. He was an amiable fellow with a mild expression, the sort of chap you'd expect to see tinkering with model trains. He invited Jill in, but Karen stayed hidden in her office, apparently on a conference call. When Jill explained the confusion about the yard sale, Bob offered to relay the message. Later that evening, we both knocked on Karen's door again. This time, she stepped out and sniffed, "I told you the application was incomplete. You listed you'd be selling crocheted items, but you didn't specify the brand of yarn. That's a detail we require for record keeping." Jill and I were both stunned. "The brand of yarn?" Jill repeated, barely containing her disbelief. "Is that actually in the guidelines?" Karen gave us a frosty smile. "We have a standard form. All fields must be filled out. Unless I have complete information, I can't approve the event." Now, Jill's the sweetest person you'll meet, but she was on the verge of losing her temper. She had spent weeks organizing this sale and collecting donated items. We already posted flyers around the neighborhood and told a few local shops. It wasn't just a casual yard sale for personal profit, it was a community charity effort. Seeing Jill's frustration, Karen shrugged. "If you resubmit the form tonight with the correct yarn brand, I'll consider it first thing in the morning. But there's a late processing fee of $50 for last-minute changes." She said it so casually, like she was a bank teller collecting a routine deposit. I took a moment, inhaled slowly, and realized we were being played. This was a classic power move. But Jill, ever the optimist, complied. She walked home and meticulously filled in every single blank line Karen might pick on. She included the brand, the color variations, even the approximate yardage of each skein. Ridiculous, but we had no choice if we wanted the sale to happen. The next morning, we waited and waited. By noon, there was still no email, no phone call, nothing. Finally, around 1 p.m., an HOA board member named Harold, who we'd never even met, delivered a note to our door. It was an official permit, yes, but it stipulated we could only run the yard sale between 7 a.m. and 9 a.m. because the board does not want prolonged traffic in the community. 2 hours? That was it? We debated cancelling altogether. Jill was deflated. But we'd advertised a start time of 8 a.m. We had people from outside the neighborhood planning to come by 9 or 10. Cancelling would be such a letdown. Jill's voice trembled with disappointment when she said, "Let's just do it. Even if it's only 2 hours, maybe we can raise a bit of money." So the next day, we scrambled to set everything up at 6:30 a.m. I hammered in a sign, Jill arranged her blankets, scarves, and crocheted animals. A handful of neighbors came early to show support, and we started collecting donations. Everything was going smoothly until 8:45 a.m., when Karen appeared with a clipboard and a stern expression. "You're going to need to wrap this up," she said, glancing at her watch. "It's almost 9. I tried to reason with her, explaining that folks were still arriving, but she folded her arms and insisted. "Rules are rules. If I don't enforce them, I'm negligent in my duties. Don't put me in that position." I suspect she was enjoying it, this display of power. Some of the neighbors who were there, especially Carl, the Navy vet, and Ruth, the nurse, challenged her. "Come on, Karen, it's just for a couple more minutes," Carl muttered. But she was unmoved. Reluctantly, we started packing up. The proceeds barely covered the supply costs, let alone gave us anything substantial for the animal rescue. Jill was close to tears. After everyone left, we sat on our porch, the hot Florida sun beating down, wondering what we'd done to earn Karen's ire. It was clear she had some vendetta, or maybe just a pathological need for control. Little did we know, the yarn fiasco and the truncated yard sale were just her opening acts. Because in the coming weeks, Karen would intensify her campaign, forcing me to stand up for my family and confront her head-on. After the yard sale debacle, Karen seemed emboldened. She zeroed in on any minuscule detail she could find to drag us before the HOA board. One morning, I stepped outside to see a bright orange slip pinned to my front door, a notice of violation. The reason? Improper edging of lawn boundary. Apparently, the grass near the shared walkway was an inch longer than their standard. I'd mowed 2 days before, but Florida lawns can grow quickly. At that point, it felt like Karen was measuring individual blades of grass, searching for an excuse to harass us. I decided enough was enough. I'd had a casual chat with some of our neighbors, Carl, Ruth, and a gentle retired teacher named Miriam. They all shared similar stories of Karen's micromanaging, unauthorized potted plants, minor paint scuffs on fences, overly strict quiet hours. Residents felt too intimidated to push back. But collectively, we were fed up. Miriam suggested that we attend the next HOA board meeting en masse. It was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in the community hall. Typically, these gatherings were snooze fests where Karen presented a list of petty infractions, the board quietly nodded, and that was that. But we decided to show up in numbers. Between me, Jill, and a handful of neighbors who'd been on the receiving end of Karen's nitpicking, we had a small but determined group. When the meeting started, Karen sat at the front table with 3 other board members, Harold, the same fellow who delivered our 2-hour yard sale permit, a timid woman named Jean, and a bored-looking man in his 70s who introduced himself simply as Mac. The official agenda covered typical items like the landscaping budget and pool maintenance schedules. But then Karen announced, "We have a growing concern about covenant violations. I'd like to propose stricter fines and an expedited enforcement process." That was our cue. I raised my hand. Before we jump to stricter fines, can we address some of the complaints residents have about the current enforcement methods? Karen glared at me, but she forced a tight-lipped smile. "Certainly, we always welcome feedback, Mr. Robinson. Please keep it concise." I stood up, glancing around at my neighbors for support. "We believe the enforcement is becoming excessive and arbitrary. Many of us have received notices for minor or trivial issues, like the specific brand of yarn sold at a charity sale, or grass being 1 inch taller than an arbitrary standard. It feels more like harassment than maintaining community standards." Carl chimed in. "And the yard sale fiasco? That was for a good cause. We could have raised much more if it hadn't been limited to 2 hours." Karen let out a curt laugh. "All events must adhere to the rules. If you had read the guidelines thoroughly, you'd know that." I spotted Mac at the table, fiddling with his pen, seemingly uneasy. So I pressed on. "With respect, we did read the handbook. Nowhere does it list yarn brands or 2-hour yard sale limits. These rules were decided by you unilaterally, or so it seems. At the very least, they weren't communicated clearly, leaving new residents, and some long-time ones, confused and penalized." A murmur of agreement rippled through the small audience. For the first time, Karen looked flustered. She motioned to Harold for backup, but he avoided eye contact. Jean cleared her throat and glanced down at her notes. I took the opportunity to propose something bold. "I'd like to request an audit of the HOA's rulemaking and enforcement procedures." We should form a committee of homeowners to review the processes, so that none of us feel targeted. Karen's face went red. An audit? That's completely unnecessary. The board functions perfectly well, and everything is transparent. If you have an issue, you can write an official letter. Miriam cut her off, her gentle voice carrying surprising authority. We've tried that. We either get no response or get buried in more arbitrary demands. We pay HOA dues, we have a right to be heard, and you can't govern by intimidation. The tension in the room was palpable. Mac, the older gentleman on the board, coughed and finally spoke up. A review committee might not be a bad idea, he said, looking Karen directly in the eye. We've had quite a few new complaints, Karen. Perhaps it's time we adopt a more structured approach to ensure fairness. Karen looked furious, but she couldn't override Mac's suggestion on the spot. He was the HOA treasurer, and apparently well-respected around the community. Reluctantly, she mumbled something about considering the matter and adjourned the meeting soon after. In the days that followed, something fascinating happened. We learned that Karen had, for years, run the HOA almost single-handedly. Harold and Jean tended to agree with her to avoid confrontation, while Mac spent most of his time balancing the budget and wasn't involved in day-to-day management. Once we spoke out publicly, other residents felt emboldened to share their own experiences. A collective grumbling rose, stories of Karen's overreach piling up. One neighbor revealed how she'd installed a small greenhouse for her orchids, only to find Karen prowling around her backyard with a tape measure, insisting it was 2 inches too tall. Another discovered that Karen had threatened to tow a visiting friend's car for being too old and unsightly, which sounded downright discriminatory. As the momentum built, I drafted a petition requesting a re-evaluation of Karen's position as board chair. People seemed eager to sign, especially after hearing about Jill's crocheted yard sale fiasco. Even Karen's husband, Bob, seemed embarrassed by his wife's antics. Jill bumped into him at the supermarket one morning, and he apologized for Karen's behavior, mumbling about how he just wants to keep the peace at home. Within a week, we had enough signatures to compel the board to hold a special meeting to review Karen's leadership. She tried to stall with legal jargon, quoting sections of the HOA bylaws that no one had ever heard of, but Mac stepped in to confirm that we had followed proper procedure. He scheduled the session for a Saturday morning, giving us all a chance to attend. The final showdown took place in the same community hall. This time, it was packed. Residents, some who I'd never even seen before, crowded in to witness the vote. Karen started by listing all her accomplishments: crisp landscaping, secure community gates, timely collection of dues. But as soon as she opened the floor for discussion, the dam burst. Person after person stood up to recount how they felt bullied, harassed, or singled out. The greenhouse fiasco, the repeated violation notices for minor infractions, the intimidation tactics, dozens of stories came pouring forth. Eventually, Mac called for an official vote of no confidence in Karen's ability to chair the HOA. Eyes shifted around the room. Even Harold and Jean looked uncomfortable, especially with so many neighbors demanding change. When the hands went up, it was overwhelming. Karen was voted out as chair by a landslide. The look on her face was a mix of shock, rage, and humiliation. That afternoon felt like a breath of fresh air. The board appointed Mac as interim chair until they could hold proper elections. We returned home with the satisfaction of having stood up for ourselves and winning. Of course, Karen still lived in the neighborhood, and we crossed paths occasionally. But she couldn't wield her petty clipboard or binder of obscure rules anymore. Whenever I see her walking her yappy little terrier, I just nod politely and keep on my way. Since then, Jill and I have settled into our retirement more peacefully. We still keep a tidy lawn, follow the sensible rules, and make a point to join community events. But thanks to that final showdown, our neighbors can enjoy their homes without fearing a Karen inspection at dawn. The best part? Our next yard sale, fully approved by the new board, ran the entire weekend. We raised over $1,000 for the animal shelter and crocheted more blankets than ever. We learned the hard way that sometimes, to find real peace, you have to stand up to tyranny, even if it's just over crocheted yarn and an extra inch of grass. And in the end, the community is stronger for it.